Question was asked about where my process is in terms of getting reestablished ELCA clergy. My meeting with the bishop on Wednesday went, to my mind, very well. I like the bishop of the synod a lot. It was very clear to me that when we started the conversation that he was a little concerned because what we're doing here and how I got involved in this congregation is not the way it normally happens or should happen. And so there were some questions on his part. I think by the time we were done talking, the bishop had a much more, I mean, he clearly was more relaxed. Body language, everything was like, he was way more relaxed with me. He presented a couple of possibilities going forward. One of the things that is true in the ELCA, for me to get back on the clergy roster, I have to do it through the bishop in South Dakota. Now, I didn't know this, but a possibility is, this would be the decision of the bishop in South Dakota. It's in his court. He could, in fact, send me over to this synod, and I would go through the process in this synod, rather than having to drive back to South Dakota for. The bishop said there's one line in the bylaws of the ELCA that allows for that to happen, and it's for people like myself. Say I left the clergy roster in Southern California and now lived in New York. Yeah. And that was put in there as a way for people to, just for practical purposes. But it is the option of the bishop in the synod in which the person came out of in the first place.
You'd have to go to a closer bishop.
Well, I could. Nothing is set in stone yet. And the Bishop Guffian, don't ask me to spell it because it's weird. It's got G's and J's and all kinds of odd letters at it.
Is he Scandinavian?
I think probably Danish, which is unpronounceable.
Yes, I agree.
Anyway, he was going to send me a copy of what he was going to send off to the Bishop of South Dakota. So I will know, once he gets that written up, he will know I will know what he's recommending, and then we'll go, then, hopefully that leads to steps beyond. One of the things I did find out that was true, that I thought was true, and he said, he says, assuming we go forward with this.
Assuming?
Well, he started out with if, so.
And then he went to assuming.
Yes, so went to assuming, which I thought was a positive step.
More positive than if?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so he's, but he could, and I thought this was true, there is a process in it, and really what it's designed for is, say a church is in the kind of nowhere and doesn't look like they're going to get a pastor. A lay person in that congregation could be raised up as the pastoral leader, and the bishop could commission that person to preside at the sacrament. Only in that church.
Okay, well, that makes,
which makes sense. Yeah. And there would be a signed contract between that person and the congregation with kind of the parameters of how this ministry was going to shape out, and a commitment on that person's part to do the training necessary. But anyway, that is the possibility out there, and I could do that paperwork with this congregation, and because I got the distinct impression that he would like to get that going
right away,
real fast. That was my impression.
Well, how fast? Yesterday, we could have done it yesterday.
We could have done it yesterday.
Well, yeah, and if any, and those of you who don't have a lot of experience with the inner workings of this denomination or any denomination.
Oh, I do.
Is everything moves really slowly.
Like snail pace.
Yeah. The letter we got from Heather Pell, who who met with the bishop and I. What's that?
You said her name's Hell?
Heather Appel.
Oh,
Uphill.
APPEL. She has been here. She led worship
Yes,
a few months
yes,
ago.
yes, she did, yes.
Like her a lot. She is the person that is on the synod staff that deals with personnel. That's her job description. So, she had written back some information to Pat, because Pat had a bunch of questions about compensation and insurance and all that stuff. And there's all kinds of stuff to work out. I told Katie today, who said, I hope you will stay, based on compensation. I said, I'm not doing this. Yeah, I've got to live, but I'm not. We all have to live, but I'm not doing this for the paycheck. There's things that I believe that are way more important than that. And so whatever we can work out with the compensation, I will soon be in a little over a week. I will be 62. I haven't had insurance for the last 2 years, and that scares the living daylights out of me. So one of the things we have to look at, and it is possible that we don't have to put me on ELCA insurance. We can maybe go through the exchanges, and as long as I'm covered, we will fulfill all righteousness if we can figure out how to get me insurance, so that what I can't do is work here and not have any insurance. And like I said, it makes me crazy not to have it, but I just can't afford it right now. Even with the exchanges.
I wish we could give you everything you deserve and more. I do, because we would.
Well, and I know that, but I firmly understand financial realities. I deal with them myself. I understand what congregations deal with. I've been a pastor of small congregations for a lot of years. Now, the congregation in Sioux Falls towards the end wasn't paying me at all, which was fine because I had a pretty good secular job and worked full time. But right now that reality is different. So anyway, but I still think the fact that I got the phone call from Pat on the day that TGI Fridays closed, and that job dried up in the morning, and this opportunity opened up. You can't look at that and say, that was just pure circumstance. I don't believe in pure circumstance like that. Not when it seems that obvious.
I don't do coincidences either.
And I have said, the other thing was, when 6 years ago when I talked to the Bishop of South Dakota about becoming a pastor again, he told me, he said, I'll be point blank with you. He said, there are 2 congregations probably in South Dakota that would accept an open gay or lesbian partnered pastor. And I knew right away what one of those congregations was, and he said, and neither of them are looking for a pastor. He was at that time, there was talk about me going to the Episcopal Church, but getting through the ELCA process. The problem with the Episcopal Church was they really wanted me to go to the reservation, which was not really that's not where my skill set.
Like an Indian reservation?
Yes. South Dakota, in the Episcopal Church in South Dakota, this is unusual. The majority of the people who are Episcopalian in South Dakota are minority persons. It has to do with the history of back in the day when this was frontier. Missionaries got into fistfights with each other over who was going to convert the heathens. Whether, big Baptists were beating up Episcopalians, and Episcopalians were beating up Catholics, and Catholics were beating up, Baptists, and et cetera.
Imagine that in here.
Congress intervened and assigned reservations to particular denominations. South Dakota was assigned to the Episcopal Church,
Ah,
and the reservations in South Dakota. Because of black elk, the black elk made a particular, petition to the United States Congress that Catholics also be allowed
With
to.
an elk?
Black elk, is the guy's name.
Oh, okay.
You gotta remember Native American names. Often are like that. But his name was Black Elk. He was a famous Lakota leader, and he requested the Catholic Church step in. And so South Dakota, Native Americans are either Catholic or Episcopalian.
Or at least from that tribe.
If you're Navajo, and this is the only other, if you're Navajo, if you're Christian, you're gonna be Presbyterian. Because that was who was the Presbyterians were assigned to Navajo.
What about Cherokee?
I don't know. I don't, those are the only two places I know about.
Okay.
Anyway, so, yeah, there's lots of really, really obscure places in South Dakota where there are Episcopal churches. None of them are any places that most people would want to live.
So when was this that all the Congress had to get in?
In the 19th century, I don't remember what year, I have no idea. But it was the 19th century.
I had a colleague who was on one of those reservations in South Dakota, and then came to Illinois. And we had to almost re-induct him into society because he had lived on that reservation, you know, he went by reservation rule, and what he.
Reservations are sovereign nations,
Kinda.
and so the laws are different, and the way things are done are different, and Native American culture is very, very different from most white European culture, and radically different in many ways. And those cultural differences, that's where some of the conflict comes from.
Property laws.
Anyway, that was the situation in South Dakota. That was not someplace that I felt I had gifts for, and so, and the Episcopal bishop kind of said, you're getting off the road.
But they spoke English. didn't
Thanks
they?
a lot, I need to hear that.
What's that?
Yeah, like if you went to that church, they understood English.
Oh, absolutely. But the service might be held in Lakota.
So that was,
The service might be held in Lakota.
so that was why you said you didn't have the skills for it, you don't speak Lakota?
I don't have the cultural skills that it would take to do.
There's a lot of different, the culture skills, as I remember Ray Cunning, and he taught us a lot of that, because we were just blown away with how he was, and there is a major cultural divide. And so I can understand when you said I can't,
Don't
whatever.
become
Can
Americanized
you tell
by
us
this
one
point, I
example?
would assume.
Not on those reservations.
No.
Okay, well,
But I mean, we did.
here's a classic one, and this one, you know, you may have heard the expression, gay time.
Yeah? No?
No, well, means we all, gay people tend to run late.
No.
There's Native American
That's
time.
still our time.
There's Native American time. It is not clock time. It really is not. And there's a cultural thing in which things happen when they're supposed to happen. You don't follow some kind of clock or calendar. It's just not cultural. And it makes us white folks crazy. And you schedule something for 10 o'clock and it might happen at 1 or 2 in the afternoon.
It's a shame.
It's cultural.
It's a cultural
It's
thing.
a cultural thing, and if you don't understand that, the same is true in the African American community. But the problem is then when you have a job and your boss is white and you come 3 hours late, or that's what's perceived, you're not going to keep your job very long, and it's really, really difficult to
Cross that divide.
cross that divide. It can be people who are really skilled at it. Kempton Baldrige spent like 6 summers on the reservation in South Dakota. And there was an elderly woman who kind of adopted him as a grandma. And she was, this is the way, and he, now I don't remember the word, he described himself with this word that is frequently used about white folk. It's a Lakota word. And she was, no, you are not that, because that word doesn't mean white folks. And so, you know, I mean, just because you heard that said about white folks, well, I mean, that's what really is the Lakota word for white folk.
Yeah.
I had a friend that moved to Ireland for a while and was living there, and she was a totally type A personality, so the clock meant a lot to her.
Mhm.
Well, not as much as it did with the Irish, because she no sooner got there than she went to a grocery store, and the checker halfway checking her out, looked up at the clock and went, "Oh, tea time," and turned around and walked off, and left her standing there with half of her stuff not checked. And she's like, wait, and she's like, "Oh, the other girl will be back from her tea time in just a minute," and off she went. I mean, that's like the opposite of Indian.
Yeah.
Because that's like, it's my tea time,
And everything else is gonna come to an
and
end.
everything
The
stops.
world stops.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of things. One of the things I learned very quickly with Native American culture, if somebody says they're a cousin, we think of a cousin as being children of our parents' siblings. Cousin in Native American tradition doesn't even actually have to be a blood relative. It's just how you perceive your connection to that person. An auntie in Lakota culture is not necessarily an aunt.
The wise woman.
But yeah, that you have some connection with. So, you know, having been owning apartments in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and renting to a Native American person, and I said, you know, is it okay if my cousin comes to live with me, and then there's 14 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment?
This is my cousin.
This is my cousin, this is my cousin, you know. It's way different, and you know, and it's not just not that I can't cope with that, but I moved to Sioux Falls originally because living in a town of 20 people made me nuts. And I did that for 5 years, and I had enough of it. So Sioux Falls is all things being equal, I live in Chicago. I love big cities, I just do.
Well,
I don't live there, and that's fine. But I told Tony when we moved to Metropolis, I said if Paducah wasn't just across the river, I couldn't do this.
you can handle
I
that.
couldn't handle that. So anyway,
Well, we like you. folks. I'm
that's
glad
a
you
whole
like
lot of
it.
background about why I didn't end up being a pastor in South Dakota. The other circumstances are that I find beyond coincidental is that I probably fell into, by pure accident, or not accident, a church that would accept me as a pastor.
You are a fearless leader.
Well, but not that would not be true of every congregation in Western Kentucky. Let's be well, but let's be honest about that. So I see a whole lot of things have come together in ways that none of us expected, and
we're blessed that they have.
and as am I. So I am confident that all of this stuff will work itself out. The maps and the one of the things, and the bishop raised that I had never thought of. He said, you know that ultimately and finally this is the Bishop of South Dakota's decision. And he doesn't have to give a reason for not approving.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't have to. For not approving. People who know him think he will. But he said, what if you didn't get approved, I and we would have to find a way to separate.
Well,
And that would be a painful thing. for everybody involved.
So we couldn't do the contract like you were saying,
If the bishop in South Dakota just says absolutely not, I don't expect him to do that. Back in the day, he and I were kind of friends, so.
so
we
we're
were-
not
but
friends now?
he's changed. He's become a bishop.
Mhm.
They used to joke in the Anglican Church in England that when hands were laid on to make a bishop by at least 3 other bishops, that there was an audible clunk when his spine fell out. Bishops frequently become highly political because that's reality. Some bishops are bureaucrats and administrators. Other bishops are pastors. And my sense about Bishop Guffian is that he's a pastor. And he's right. If he wanted to be legalistic about, he could be all over me and all over us. He's choosing not to do that because he's not that kind of guy,
Well,
which is a good thing.
And we're praying
State
for
of the
cost
world
of
these days, when you've got a willing soul and a willing congregation, why
Why make it difficult? Why make it difficult?
Why make
And
it difficult?
and there's a shortage of clergy in the ELCA. When I graduated from seminary, there was actually a glut. It took me 9 months to get a call when I graduated from seminary. Now, almost everybody has a call before they even graduate. And I had a few classmates that actually had calls before we graduated, but not many. But anyway.
So let's pray for positive outcome and
yes,
if they get hateful and say we have to separate, it can take a long time getting ready to do that. First we have to get ready,
I'll
get
send
ready.
in Guido. We don't take care of that.
So,
Nice to have people with connections.
yeah.
I actually knew a man who knew Guido.
This is our last confirmation get-together. I first of all, there's some things that I don't know. Are you a member of St. Matthew?
I am.
You're not.
I'm still technically, I think, a member of Broadway Methodist.
Okay. I am hoping that our 2 confirmands that are off in college, that one of the early, that they're on the colleges are on break, one of the very early Sundays in January, which happens to be the feast of the baptism of Jesus. It's just like right after Epiphany, so within like the first week and a half of January. I would love for that to be Confirmation Sunday.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
If they are on break at that time, and I've started cards to both of them, saying because they've not been with us, I want to say please watch these. If you haven't done so, watch the classes online, either on our website or YouTube, either one. And also, will this date work for you? Well, it's early in January. I haven't even looked at next year's calendar to find out for sure. But the feast, the festival of the baptism of Jesus would be perfect for this. If it can't work out, then we will make it work. But
I was thinking Alex was telling me her last day of vacation was the 6th of January. And I think that's like the first Sunday.
okay, the 6th of January is actually Epiphany, so it would actually be the following Sunday that we're talking about.
13th, January 13th, yeah. She'll be back then.
She'll be back, and we'll work something out. We'll make
All
something
right.
happen. I don't know whether there's 2 Sundays after Christmas this year. We could do it on one of those.
There's the 30th after Christmas, it's the 23rd and the 30th.
And then it's the 6th, and then it's 6th is Epiphany. Well, we could actually do it on Epiphany as well. And so if you are not a member of St. Matthew's and would like to become a member at that time, we can, and if you want to be confirmed, since you've been through this, don't have to be.
Oh, I
there's no requirement.
If you weren't being confirmed in the Methodist church.
Again, if you've been confirmed in another tradition, we certainly don't require it. We accept that. If you wanna be reconfirmed, that's okay too. It's up to you. We'll talk more about it when we get closer to that time, but those are the kind of the options that are out there. And it will be, I'm sure we'll schedule this around Christmas because the two girls will be back. I'm going to ask them to write a couple of you don't have to do this, a couple of short essays, 2 or 3 page essays.
Yeah.
Those of you who have been here the whole time don't have to do that, but I'm gonna ask you to do that because I haven't had a chance to get any feedback from them at all. I'm not gonna make it difficult, but, I think historically the churches have made everything way too flippin' difficult. I'm not big on that. One of the things I wanted to kind of, and if you've not read through this, please read it cover to cover. I mean, it's like reading a graphic novel. I mean, it's not a really time-consuming project, but it's really well written and does a good job of explaining, what Lutherans are historically about. A couple of things I did want to do is talk a little bit about Lutheran theology. I mentioned it actually in today's sermon a little bit, and I try to bring a little Lutheran theology into my preaching on a regular basis. There's a sense in which, after the Reformation, in many ways, we can identify a number of these things where Lutherans essentially threw out the baby with the bathwater. Our relationship to the saints is one of those. It's because the medieval church was depending on the prayers of the saints, and I talked about the saints banking merits, as it were, to offset our demerits, so that we could get into heaven. Luther rejected that as nonsense, which of course it is. But sometimes we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater and forgot that we do affirm that the saints are still with us and still surround us, and we pray not to them but with them. So if you have a personal favorite saint, it is not crazy and it's not non-Lutheran to say, Saint Francis, be with me as I offer these prayers. That's perfectly okay. It's okay to light a candle. The Episcopal Church that I was a member of, we had a rack of candles, just like a Roman Catholic church, and the candles are purely symbolic. They don't do anything really, except when you light a candle, that is symbolic of our prayers continuing. That it's not that we speak before God is not just a one-time thing and we're done. It's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing relationship. And so, having a candle burn for a day after the prayers have been said is just symbolic of that. Doesn't make I had a friend of mine who said, when talking about it, said, well, it's kind of a super prayer. Well, no, there is no such thing as a super prayer. It is just a reminder to us and to others. And it reminds us of those people who've been there to pray before us. That our prayer is not a really solitary thing, even though we may go into our own room to offer those prayers. We are still surrounded by this mystical body that is still there no matter what. And so people who come to our house, I have a little statue of the BVM, Blessed Virgin Mary, BVM. And And I love that statue, not because it's a piece of concrete, you know? But the story behind my having that, I think, is hysterical. I used to have a cleaning business. And one of the people we cleaned for, she was this very kind of unusual human being. She was a medical doctor. She was a multimillionaire. It's not that she had made that much money as a doctor. She invested very well. And when she was a doctor, she put away 70% of her income. 70%. Yeah. Lived in a big old house. 70s decor from hell. And she opened a museum. A bunch of her money went to this museum to permanently endow it. She had enough money to permanently endow this museum. And the name of the museum is the Museum of Visual Materials. And I laughed about it at the time because it's like, okay, would there be a museum of invisible materials? Anyway, and it's in Sioux Falls and it's used a lot.
That's where it was.
It's in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is where she lived. And she bought junk at rummage sales for years. She had collections of, remember the troll dolls?
Oh, yeah.
She had a big collection of those. She had collection of just the clowns. Always creeped me out.
Yeah.
She had collections of carved elephants.
She was a hoarder.
She was a hoarder, except she was she was so OCD. She was the most incredibly organized hoarder that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
She had boxes of again, stuff that she had bought at rummage sales, scraps of cloth. Her whole attic is full of scraps of cloth. Buttons. She would sit and sort buttons by color, size, and shape. And put them in little baggies and have them all organized by color in totes.
And it made her so happy to do that.
You know, way OCD. But she was an atheist. And she was not just an atheist, she was a pretty rabid atheist. And she would have no truck with anything that had to do with faith. She had a friend who she was very close to, who was also kind of an unusual woman, who lived in Arkansas, South Dakota. When her friend died, this doctor inherited the entire estate. Well, the stuff was boxed up and shipped to South Dakota. One of the boxes had a concrete statue of, another box had a carved, or this BVM. And she opened them up and she was horrified. She was actually horrified by this statue. And her next door neighbor was a friend of mine and was saying in choir with me at Calvary Cathedral, and she just shunned this stuff off to the neighbor, who said, "Do you want these?" said to me. I'm like, sure. Well, the statue of St. Francis that I set it out by my house in the winter, that was the first one that I got, and the first winter it just crumbled. It just didn't hold up to the weather. But the statue of St. Mary has lasted now down here 10 years. But so, you know, the fact that that had been received by this atheist who was horrified by it, and it ended up with me, I kind of enjoy it in my backyard, you know. She's not going to go into a bathtub or anything, but so again, there's nothing wrong with us honoring those who've gone before. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, I was told a bunch of nonsense when I was a kid. I was told, you know, those Catholics, they worship statues. You know, I never knew a Catholic. I mean, once I became an adult, I realized that was like bunk. They're not worshiping statues. The statues function the same way as icons do in the Eastern Church. They are reminders of those who have gone before us. And sometimes, you know, in particular the Catholic tradition, we're supposed to kind of emulate the sanctity of those folk. Well, we do that really poorly. I mean, it is worthwhile to strive towards holiness and righteousness and all of those things. But Luther says we are both saints and sinners, and usually you do the sinner part better. Once in a while, there is someone who is unusual.
Didn't Luther say go and sin boldly?
Okay. Yes, Luther said that. But frequently it's misquoted or it's misunderstood. Luther said that in a letter to Philip Melanchthon. And I've used Philip Melanchthon's name here before. He was co reformer with Luther, and he wrote the Augsburg Confession. He was a systematic theologian. Martin Luther was not a systematic theologian. He did not think about, okay, if I say this, then how does that affect this over here? Whereas Melanchthon, his mind worked that way, and so he was the original. So Melanchthon was in the throes of a moral dilemma. Sometimes in life you're faced with choices, the morality of which is not clear. That's when Luther said sin boldly. Even if you're wrong, make the best choice you think you can make. It may not be right, but you've got to make a choice, and that's when it's not, sin boldly is not do whatever you damn well please. That's not what he was saying. He was saying when you're faced with a difficult decision that you can argue morality from one direction or the other, go with your best instinct, and God will forgive you if you're wrong.
Is it saying like go confidently?
Yeah. And it's consistent with Luther's notion that God loves us. God loves us. God loves us. God loves us. No ifs, ands, buts about it. There's no, in Lutheran theology, I think I may have used this example in the class before, but it's a good thing to remember. If you say to someone, I love you, but, and follow it up with, you did this to annoy me, or however you finish that sentence. Nobody hears what came before the but.
Well,
Nobody, because the but negates, and oftentimes, and I think I use the Missouri Synod Lutherans as an example of this. You are saved by grace, but. I mean, they don't actually put it that way, but that's the implication, and that is quite frankly what I hear from a lot of religious leaders of a lot of kind of Protestant denomination, Baptists and what have you. God loves you, but that kind of crosses off God loves you. You are saved by grace, but grace, God's grace, which I hope you remember that I find as God's unearned love and favor. Unearned. God doesn't love us because we're so damn lovable. We're not. God loves us because God loves us. And we are God's children. Anybody who's a parent knows that their kids can drive them nuts from time to time.
For little periods of time.
please take these for a little bit. Give me a break.
Yes, exactly. I would get into playpen. So they could.
But parents, in spite of the children driving into distraction usually still love their kids. That's true of God as well. I know we irritate the piss out of God from time to time. And sometimes we behave really badly. And sometimes as a culture, we behave really badly. And sometimes the church, we behave really badly. And sometimes as individuals, we behave really badly. But God still loves us in spite of all that. There's a story from Elie Wiesel. It's a story he tells in Night. And because it's a story about the Holocaust, but those of us who are followers of Jesus kind of can get this. The story is that in one of the camps, the Nazis decided to execute a 12-year-old, 10 or 12-year-old boy. And they hung him. One of the things is, if you're going to kill somebody by hanging, part of what kills the person is either breaking the neck or strangling to death. This child was not heavy enough to strangle himself. And so he was just hanging there, but surviving. And this went on for a long time. Finally, one of the guards goes up and hangs on the kid's legs to kill the child. And somebody said, "Where is God in this?" The hanging child. There is God.
The child one?
That's how God comes to us. As Christians, we say that crucified man is God. The crucified man is God. When I unpacked my book, and I don't know whatever happened to it, whether I gave it away, there's a Scandinavian theologian, Lutheran, by the name of Jürgen Moltmann. But the title of his book is The Crucified God. And then, you look at that title just kind of draws us up short. And it's like, yeah, that's what we affirm. That is what we affirm. That God is with us in our suffering. It's not just when stuff's going good. It's when things are going really bad. That God, and that's when, to us, emotionally, oftentimes it feels like God is furthest away. The truth of the matter is, that's when God is nearest. What Brenton said? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's
the same thing, yeah.
the other thing that I want to emphasize about Lutheran theology is Luther's emphasis on law and gospel.
Sola fide, sola scriptura.
Yep. For Luther, the function of law, Old Testament law, some passages in the New Testament can be interpreted as law, some of the words of Jesus. Law is, there's two uses of the law. One is theological and the other is practical. First use of the law is theological. And it is, the law is the mirror that is held up to us that shows to us that we are sinners. The law shows us that we are incapable of achieving God's righteousness. It reminds us that we fail at that. Now there's also the second use of the law is civil. And that is law as we understand it. You drive on the right-hand side of the road. You stop at stop signs. You don't kill people. I mean, that's and if you do, there are legal consequences for that. The first use of the law that shows us that we fail to live up to God's expectations, there's consequences for that too. You know, there's eternal consequences for that. But that eternal consequence was negated by the gospel. Because Jesus died, we could live. And that's a theological assertion. And there are passages in the Bible that can, depending on our circumstances, can be either law or gospel, depending on what's going on in our lives and how, and all of that stuff. You know, the gospel, the tough one we had a few weeks ago about the wealthy young man who it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a wealthy person to get into heaven. That's law for most folks. But you know who it's gospel for? Folks who are poor.
Yeah.
Because in this, and you know, in American culture, we're horrible at that. We get our self-worth from stuff and our employment and all of that. How we're doing in school. That affects our self-worth. What we have, all of that. Just somebody becomes unemployed. If you know anybody that's ever happened to, one of the first things that happens to folks is they go get depressed. Because our sense of worth is attached to what we do and what we have. That's contrary to the gospel. It certainly falls in reality over here under law. And gospel is that's not where our self-worth ought to come from. Our self-worth ought to be, I'm a child of God. End of story. End of story.
But
That's
we
what-
don't think that way.
We don't think that way, and it's
we
called.
get criticized when we do. People used to tell me, "Don't toot your own horn," and I said, "God gave me the horn. You know, God gave me this horn to toot, and I'm sorry if you don't like the fact that I am well loved and richly blessed, because I do. You know, I appreciate that very much, and I'm going to share that with people. And I said, well, don't toot your own horn too much. Why not?
Why not?
God gave me this horn."
But that's exactly what you're saying is, we are a child of God, and that's how we should be hanging our
Hanging our reality on.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I asked for what will meet my needs, and that's all. You know, and
But we live in a culture that values and includes values persons based on what they've got.
I have examples of that too.
I mean, we do that. I mean, and I forget, a few weeks ago I was talking about, you know, people being famous for just being famous. You know, what did Paris Hilton ever do?
Yeah, well, I like that question.
You know, why is this person famous? You know, God only knows, except for her last name, you know, or the Kardashians, or, you know, there's a lot of people out there that are famous just for they were good at self-promotion.
Exactly.
You know, that's the bottom line. And why anybody cares, I have no idea, but it seems like people care about that nonsense. But our claim needs to be over here. That we have value because we are God's child, and that God loves us. Luther, when he was feeling beset by doubt, and I mean, he records, writes about doing this from time to time. If he felt assailed by evil, he would say, "But I'm baptized," which was his way of saying, "I belong to God. Nothing out there can harm me, really." Made me quite miserable for a while, but nothing can ultimately harm me because I belong to God. I'm God's child, and the sign of that in the church is baptism. baptism is necessary for salvation, lest we go there. I grew up with that notion as a kid, that, you know, he had to make sure the kid got dunked as soon as it was born, because if it died before it got baptized, it was going to go to hell.
Oh, come on.
Okay, so how would you dispute this, with our neighbors down the street, the Southern Baptist? You know, someone died in their congregation, they never walked in front of the church, they never got saved, they never got baptized. You know, how do you dispute that with them when they're saying, well, they're not gonna make it to heaven, but you know, one of our sacraments is baptism. You know, they didn't make it, they didn't get baptized, you know. How do you approach that argument with them?
Here is my, where I go with that.
This is deep.
Remember that Jesus was crucified between two thieves. One of them, he turns and says, today you will with me in paradise. Jesus didn't say, were you baptized?
Yeah. But Jesus
Oh,
was.
and you were baptized in prayer.
Yeah, you're screwed.
Yeah, you're screwed.
Ta-ta! I'm off to be with the Father. You're on your own.
Yes. Looks like you're gonna be, you know, roasted marshmallows in our.
Yeah,
No water,
yeah.
no ladder.
Yeah, that is my biblical response to that question.
Pretty good.
Because and then you can expand that to, was Abraham baptized? You know, you can go through Old Testament. Now, you get with somebody who's going to really split hairs, and there was Jewish ritual washing. The baptism didn't get invented by John the Baptist. The Jews actually did a form of what we call baptism. It meant something a little different than what it means to us, but not radically so. It was a washing away of sin, and that's why. And it had to be done in certain kind of water under certain circumstances. It had to be running water and all kinds of stuff. But and that's why John the Baptist was doing the river.
Oh, because it was a river
That was moving.
How can a river run when it has no feet?
It's purely a metaphor.
When I was baptized by immersion, I had confirmed
You can't sit and
that
tell in the same water.
I
runs,
was
and you're
accepting
changing
Jesus
in the
Christ as
river
my
thing.
Savior and Lord. And then they dumped me in water, but I had to make that
We
affirmation.
went over that in
And it
philosophy
is for
class.
that procedure.
Well, and that was a good point. When the church switched from doing primarily baptism of adults, the only, and biblically you can't prove it one way or the other. We're told in Acts, and I forget who it was, what the story was. Well, it was Peter. It was the house of the Roman centurion, and it says, and the whole household was baptized. Did that household include infants? We have no way of knowing. But the church, very early on, when the church was being made up of second generation Christians, people that had converted and been baptized as adults, but they were having children. That's when the church started to do, that we know, the church started to do baptism of infants.
In that case, what happened, when I had my children baptized, they weren't promising anything, I was promising.
And that is the role of parents and sponsors at a baptism. It is their role to make those commitments on the part of
Yes.
whatever infant.
Yeah.
And I have argued, doing baptisms as just kind of pro forma. This is what we do. The only time we ever go to church is when they take the kids there to be baptized. The way the church dealt with that then, the sponsors and parents make the promises, but that's when confirmation was invented. And confirmation was the opportunity for that person was spoken for as an infant to speak for themselves.
Right.
And that's why there is a confirmation rite. And it is offering a person who is of age to make a decision, to claim what was given in baptism for themselves.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that if they don't do that, that our notion, we are so, as human beings, are so focused on, and this is, I think this has to do with original sin, quite frankly, that what we do is going to affect what God does. In other words, you have to do thus, thus, and thus in order that to be saved, or however you want to say that. I think that because we're meritoriously focused, we think that things come to us because we do stuff, and that's not consistent with Lutheran and I think general Christian theology. I've told this story again and again and again. I used to say that I had accepted Jesus as my personal Savior. I haven't said that for years. What I will say is God accepted me. But there's a huge difference in those two, the way you look at reality from those two different perspectives.
I was just sitting there thinking about Pastor Larry and I went grocery shopping on Friday, and Aldi's, there was this lady singing a hymn. Remember that?
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, and she was testifying to her faith. And as we rounded the corner, Pastor and me and Larry, and I thought, she's gonna grab one of us and say, "Are you saved?" And it would probably be Pastor. And I thought, I don't have this kind of time.
Yep.
So I thought, thank God I drove, you're gonna have to pay the groceries, because I can't sit here for 3 hours.
Yeah.
But she was quite adamant about her beliefs.
And Larry made the comment, because I've seen this woman before.
Oh, yeah.
But at Aldi's, and Larry said, "Oh, she moved here from Walmart."
I don't know, but I just knew that because I thought, oh, she's gonna grab Pastor and ask, "Are you saved?" And I'm thinking,
You don't
Yeah,
have to.
a simple answer was probably not what I was going to respond to that.
yeah, but I thought, but thank goodness somebody diverted her attention. The good Lord was with us.
Yeah.
And he diverted her attention to somebody else. And we rounded the corner and went on and filled our basket and out the door.
So anyway, I hope you found this class at least mildly interesting and informative. That in some way, maybe not in big ways, but in some way you found your faith deepened, and maybe explained a couple of things you always wondered about. Why do they do that?
Why do they do what they do?
Yeah, I hope we've at least addressed some of those questions. Like I say, I try to work a little Lutheran theology into my sermons, so it's an ongoing thing. And you know, if in the future some topic or something comes up, one of the things I would like us to do, and we've talked about this and just haven't scheduled it. Probably now it's not going to happen until after the first of the year because stuff happens.
We're in the holiday season.
We're in the holiday season. But I really would like to have a joint get together with the people from United to talk about Lutheran, UCC tradition and theology. Because in fact, we are officially in official communion with the United Church of Christ. It's complicated with grace because the pastor is disciples of Christ, which
The pastor of Grace Episcopal is not an Episcopal?
No, not Grace Episcopal. I said Grace, I meant United. United, the pastor of United Church is Disciples of Christ. He is not United Church of Christ. That's not his background. He was pastor at First Christian Church here, before he went to United. So,
Where's First Christian?
Audubon
just
Drive,
Okay, that's the other
the
one that
big
was
one,
near where
that's
I
where my
grew up.
children learned to drive in the parking lot.
Yeah, so did I.
yeah, it's right by the interstate there.
Yeah, I learned to drive there too.
Yeah, my children learned
So-
to drive in the parking lot.
And I would
That's
enjoy
where I was
having.
baptized. Right.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, that's where I was baptized.
That's an interesting thing about the Disciples of Christ as a denomination. They're very liberal as a denomination. From congregation to congregation, they may or may
Yeah.
not be. But they come out of the Anabaptist tradition. And they're not like any Baptist you've ever met.
No.
For one reason, they have communion every week.
Every week.
I don't know of a Baptist tradition anywhere where that's the case, or of any of the other kind of Anabaptist traditions like Mennonites and, getting extreme like Amish and some groups like that, Hutterites. So Disciples of Christ are kind of their own thing. Well, they are their own thing, but the way they do Christianity is really different from most other people from that Anabaptist tradition in Europe, which the Anabaptist tradition begins at the same time as Luther.
Well, according to them, it goes further back. I don't know.
Well, even Lutheranism goes before. I mean, there was a reform movement in the church prior to the Reformation.
I've heard Baptists tell me it goes back, it's older, as old as the Catholic Church.
That's nonsense.
Yeah.
That is nonsense. But remember the hymn? Give me that old time religion, which is a real popular amongst Baptists and other fundamentalists. Just like Paul and just like Silas. Wrong.
Yeah.
Wrong.
Wrong.
There's a kind of fuzzy historical memory there that no matter who you are, if you're a Christian in the Western tradition, coming out of somewhere, our roots are the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
That goes all the way back to the time of the apostles, or the Orthodox Church,
Or the Coptic.
or the Copts. The Copts and they also, we consider them part of the Orthodox tradition, even though they're really not Orthodox. I'm
They
not
have their
really.
own pope.
Yeah, that's right.
But I just learned that recently.
That's right. And they use that term. But anyway,
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time.
thank you
very much.
for being here and
Thank you for your time and your knowledge and your guidance.
challenging me with, difficult questions, and
That's
And,
okay.
That's what we're supposed to do.
that I completely,
That's my job.
and not that I am the expert in all things, but I
Yeah.
hope
Wouldn't make us happy, so.
found some useful stuff amongst it. It's like what Luther says of Scripture. Says of Scripture, it is where we find Jesus, the infant Jesus. He said all the rest of it is wood and straw. And I hope that everybody understands that, some of what I say is wood and straw as well. But hopefully you'll find baby Jesus in the middle of that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will get back